Thanks for having me. So yes, I wrote a book about the one out of 20,000 people who saved Jews during the Holocaust. So I am an inveterate optimist. But I also I wear a number of hats, and so I think I have a fairly realistic view of what's going on in the region right now. I was part of the Council on Foreign Relations. I was on the advisory committee of the task force that came up with the U.S.-Saudi a proposal for a U.S.-Saudi alliance, which was one of the kind of foundations of what was almost going to and probably will still happen. So I will say I'm an inveterate optimist, and I actually have a contrarian view that there is a significant possibility that October 7th, in retrospect, after all the horror is over, may in fact be a linchpin that led to comprehensive peace in the region. But I just want to say, I say that as somebody who it's not a Pollyanna view. It's based on, very, realpolitik and geopolitical kind of analysis, and actually talking to people in the region, particularly Arabs. And I do a lot of business in the region. And so I had written an article for Time a few months ago outlining some of this. And I just would say that this is based to some degree on some of it is open source and some of it is just conversations. But it frustrated me the extent to which, particularly in the United States, people didn't really understand what the Arab world was trying to accomplish. So what I would say is that I think that, and I'll say a few things that are probably quite obvious to many people on the call, but this was all about Iran. I think that in retrospect, this may be what you could term a catastrophic success for Hamas and for Iran. I don't think they ever realized that that this could happen to the extent that it did happen, the atrocities. And I think there's some serious consequences to them. I think it's made a U.S.-Saudi compact more likely. I think the initial compact that was very close to happening was potentially going to happen without a Palestinian state. Now I think that will be part of it. But I think that this has made the Saudis more concerned about having both Israel and the United States as an ally. And I would stress that the United States is the far more important issue for them than the Israelis. And so the security guarantee from the United States and some of the other things going along with that are the holy grail. But they also are very concerned behind closed doors that the Israelis actually finish the job here. And so, you have to separate what is said publicly with what is said privately. But I will note that, if you parse clearly the statements of like the Emirates and even the Saudis, they've been remarkably pro-Israel from the beginning and anti-Hamas. I think they're very worried, as are we, about the Iranian proxies. For whatever reason, we've opted to kind of respond with one arm tied behind our back. Iran bombed Pakistan a few weeks ago. Pakistan bombed Iran, and they're not going to bomb Pakistan again. But I think one thing that people in the West really don't understand is the concern that a lot of people in the region have about Hamas. They're not well liked. The fact that the Egyptians will not open the Rafah gate says it all. They know what the Muslim Brotherhood is. And the other thing to understand, I think, about it is that to the Iranians, like, Hamas is probably the least important of their proxies. They're Sunni and they're Arab. And so I think, it's pretty, right now Israel is in the process of restoring its deterrence. But, I think it would shock a lot of people on college campuses to know that the Egyptians came to the Israelis. And I think this is fairly public, a number of years ago during one of the missile attacks, and suggested to the Israelis that they kill every one of the Hamas fighters at that time. But of course, Israel doesn't do that kind of thing. And the IDF is actually conducting a campaign that is, probably, I think, has more precautions taken to protect civilians than the United States does. And the United States puts a high value on doing that, to the detriment of the safety of our own soldiers. So to lay out kind of like what a peace plan might have, like why I think that could happen, I think this has potentially could clear the way. Again, people make a lot of mistakes, but one thing that happened is obviously it united Israel, which I think was very dangerous. When I was in college, I studied Roman history, and we, the Jewish people spent 2,000 years in exile, largely because of fighting amongst ourselves. So if you go back and look at what happened, there could have been a deal. It was really the extremists who caused the ultimate break with the Romans. The love of Titus's life was a Jewish princess named Berenice. And so I think that's important to understand. But I think after October 7th, the whole country for the moment is united, or most of it. I think as I actually am out talking about my book with a lot of JCCs and, particularly Reform synagogues, I'm told by, the rabbi or the head of it that all of the young people went from being very progressive on October 6th to being ardent Zionists on October 7th. So obviously there's a lot of betrayal that's gone on, but I think there's also a wake-up call in the diaspora that is very important as well. I think from a leadership perspective as well, I think, three big impediments to a deal, and I'm not going to make a comment one way or the other about Netanyahu and his, weaknesses or strengths, but I think the approval rating is a disaster, and I don't see a scenario where he is going to survive in the long term, although everyone's been proven wrong, but I do think he is an impediment for a variety of reasons to what I'm about to outline. I think Hamas is going to be severely wiped out. I think anybody who says you can't uproot an ideology is largely wrong. You can look at Al-Qaeda. ISIS is resurging a little bit, but yes, you can't get rid of an ideology, but you can make it very hard for them to take action. So, and I think it's very important that Iran receives a message that there's deterrence from the U.S. and from Israel. And I do think the visit from Blinken to Abbas was very interesting, and there's a lot of pressure now on the Palestinian Authority to clean up its act, which means new leadership. And there are people who the Israelis can work with, and they're not going to be people who are doves, but they're going to have to be people who have sort of anti-Israel credentials. But anybody who watches Fauda, knows that in fact the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority work quite closely together. So they will find, I think, a leader that will be palatable to both sides. It's worth noting that the approval rating of Hamas is much higher in the West Bank than in Gaza, because the Gazans live with Hamas. So I think ultimately the reason why I think there could be peace is because I think greater geopolitical factors are at play, and that it will basically be forced by the United States and the Saudis on the Palestinians, and to some degree on the Israelis. I think, again, this is a secondary issue until recently. It is interesting to look at the protests going on, which have been the loudest in the United States in the left wing, then second loudest in parts of Europe, and it's been almost mute in the Arab world. So the Arab street seems to be remarkably quiet on behalf of Hamas. So, what a two-state solution might look like right now. I mean, even the polls in Israel show that if you ask, are you in favor of a two-state solution? No. Are you in favor of a two-entity solution? Yes. The majority of the population. So I think understanding what a Palestinian state would be is important, and people are already talking about that. And it's the Saudis have already come out and said that they will recognize Israel. The headline on the interview at CNN was like, "Saudi stands with Palestine." If you actually watch the interview, it was the foreign minister came out and said that they're supportive of Israel once there's a solution to the Palestinian problem, which obviously they need to facilitate. But they're much more interested in coordinating with Israel and Iran. Behind closed doors, they've become fairly philo-Semitic. So, I think the plan, and Ehud Barak has said this publicly, that, one day if there ever is a two-state solution, it's going to look microscopically different from what, was offered at Camp David, except there'll be a lot more dead people, unfortunately, on both sides. And, that would involve minor land swaps, a completely demilitarized Palestinian sort of state in the West Bank and Gaza. And that is something that not only has the United States endorsed, but Sisi in Egypt endorsed a few weeks ago. So I think the Arab world knows that Palestine would not have an army, would not have a military. There would be a multinational force. The IDF would be deployed along the Jordanian border. There's just no way there would be a tolerated threat to anything with Israel, but that's understood. I think the Arabs will pay, and the world will have to pay for rebuilding Gaza. I think despite what Bibi or anyone else says politically, the Israelis are going to leave Gaza. They'd have no desire to be there. Nobody wants Gaza. The Egyptians won't take Gaza, but there'll have to be a big, sort of Marshall Plan. And I think if there is a deal, there will be some sort of symbolic right of like refugees coming back from the Palestinians, and the rest of it will be a check written by Israel in the West and the Gulf Arabs. And then I think that the Jews who were expelled, who outnumber the Palestinians that were expelled, will get nothing from the Arab countries. What East Jerusalem will be the Palestinian capital, West Jerusalem will be Israeli capital. The holy sites will be under joint Israeli and international control. And then I think there would be recognition from the rest of the Arab world, at least the Saudis and the other kind of remaining sympathetic countries, and then people will focus on Iran. And I will say that, again, the Abraham Accords have obviously been a huge success. I know both from a geopolitical, but also a business and a cultural standpoint. That's an example, obviously, of Jews and Arabs who living together in a successful treaty. The Egyptian treaty has stood for many decades now, and that was after the Yom Kippur War. Several years later, it would have been sort of unthinkable at the time when Israel was almost sort of overrun, that you would have peace in the near future. And another example of I think is important is like the Good Friday Agreement, sort of now 25 years old, and the Northern Irish and the Catholic Irish were at that was about as bloody a conflict and as much hate as you could have had, and people don't even really it's been a huge success. And so I do think there actually can be peace in the region, but again, not in the short term based on sort of people just sort of deciding to beat their swords into plowshares, but because again I know that the Arab world wants it, and the US wants it, and that the real issue is Iran, which is also tied in with the real kind of chess game going on between China and Russia and North Korea and Iran and that whole axis. So obviously tons of wild cards, future of Bibi, whether Trump gets back in, whether the Iranians miscalculate, whether the Ayatollah dies. But I ultimately think Iran itself will actually potentially have regime change, but we've been waiting for that for a long time. But it is the population is pretty pro-West and actually pro-Israel. So I think maybe I'll stop there if anybody has any questions. I know it's a very contrarian view, but it is one that is being more than talked about in the behind closed doors in the U.S. and Europe and most importantly in the region.
Richard, just a question, although it doesn't have to do exactly with the topic you were speaking of. What do you hear from the spirit of the IDF soldiers?
I mean, I think it's I mean, everything I hear there is anecdotal, right? And we all have friends who are fighting there. I mean, I think it's much more difficult than they thought it was going to be, as there's like 500 miles of tunnels. But I think the morale in there is good. I think the Israelis tend to tune out the Western criticism more than people in the West do. I just think Israel has sort of a bunker mentality right now. But I think ultimately that this Rafah, they're going to. I mean, it has to. There's no alternative to defeating Hamas, and even sort of people on the left, the sort of center left people here and in Europe, and certainly behind closed doors, believe that nobody thinks that it is possible to stop the conflict without Hamas having a full-blown defeat. So I think that I think IDF's very professional and very, very focused. I think there's going to be a reckoning at the senior leadership, which they know, because it was the most catastrophic failure in the history of the state of Israel.